are you? Who is Kurtis? What do you do? How did you get into making games?
Sure. Okay, so I'm Kurtis Holme. I work in software. I do test automation at Third Wave Systems in Eden Prairie. Went to school for computer science. In school, I was really interested in AI, and I guess board games. Making games, I guess, has been something that I've always kind of done, but I didn't really realize it until later.
How so?
Well, like, as a kid, I think all kids kind of make up games,
Yeah.
That's not an abnormal thing. But maybe the extent to which I did it was.
I'm not exactly sure what you mean.
No, maybe abnormal isn't the right word, but I don't know. I at an early age, I was very into games. Obviously, I enjoyed playing them a lot. I would play by myself. I would create tournaments. So I had like a dozen different Magic the Gathering decks, and I would have this huge bracket, and I would play them all against each other until I got a winner. Never played Monopoly by myself like Andy. That is for the truly insane. But like, the earliest one that I really remember where I was like actually going about it in like with some sort of active process in mind
Mm-hmm.
was with a game called MLB Showdown.
Okay.
So this was in about 1999, I think, is when MLB Showdown came out. And this was Wizards of the Coast. And it was baseball cards, except you could play a game of baseball with the baseball cards.
Oh,
so
weird.
It,
Okay.
It was so much fun. I loved it. I mean, like baseball is one of my hugest passions, and at the time, this was when I was like playing baseball like all the time, like 6 days a week for multiple hours a day, and like, yeah, MLB Showdown. I love that game so much. I'm so sad that they discontinued it.
How
But
I guess how do people play baseball
right,
in
I'm getting to
card
that.
form? Okay. I'm just so
Yeah.
curious.
So you have the players, and they have a couple of different statistics on their cards. So they're kind of split into hitters and pitchers. The hitters have an on-base number, and the pitchers have a control number. And to simulate an at-bat, the pitcher rolls a d20, and they take the result and add it to their control. And the batter rolls a d20, they take the result and add it to their on-base number. And whoever wins that roll has advantage. So that's kind of simulating like a pitching count sort of thing, where like a hitter will be, in the advantage in the showdown,
Okay.
quote unquote.
Yeah.
And so they also have a chart where you have different results that can happen. So both the hitters and the pitchers have a different chart, and their charts will be better the better the player is. So that has a roll result for your action for that at bat, and it had, what was it? Strikeouts, ground ball, fly ball, walk, single plus, double, triple, homer for both the pitcher and the hitter. So if the hitter won the roll, they have a strikeout. Let me take a step back. So after you figure out who has the advantage, that player then rolls the dice to see what happens for the at bat. So if the pitcher wins, they roll the dice. They take the result and look up on their chart what happens. So pitchers,
Okay.
everything below like a 16 is usually an out. The really good pitchers might be all the way up to like everything up to an 18 is an out. Whereas if a hitter gets the advantage, then it's usually like 1 to 5 or 6 is an out, and then like 18 or higher is a homer, stuff like that. So you play out a game of baseball like that, rolling a d20.
That almost sounds like an RPG system. No, that does sound like an RPG system.
It is.
That's
It
really
is an
interesting.
RPG. It actually was kind of my first introduction to kind of an RPG system, because I hadn't really played like Dungeons and Dragons or anything like that before that point.
Huh. Okay, so you fell in love with this game.
Yep.
And how did that go into like making your own game?
Right. So I don't think I have it with me. I think it's at my parents' house. But basically, I became so enthralled with this game that I wanted to do two things with it. One was that the rules didn't encompass for all of the intricacies of baseball like I wanted it to. It was pretty much... it wasn't just rolling dice. You also had a strategy deck, and you drew... I don't remember exactly how many cards you would draw, but you would have like 3 cards per inning, something like that. And the cards would be things like steal a base, or... what are some of the other ones? Like, or give a bonus to your swing if you have a lefty batting and it's a righty pitching, stuff like that.
Okay.
But it wasn't, it was because it's a deck and it's random. It didn't make much sense to me, because like if you're trying to play like the advantage of having a lefty versus a righty, that's something you're playing for in the order in your lineup. It's not like a random thing that happens.
Yeah.
So like I kind of built out rules for a lot of these things that weren't in there, and I had a whole bunch of stuff. Like I added in things for there's a chance that you could have an error, or there's a chance for or some of the others.
So like you modified the outcome tables for these different occurrences?
Yeah, modified or added if they didn't exist.
Okay. So you were like modding this game.
Yep.
But like in the tabletop sense rather than in the...
Exactly.
And how old were you roughly?
10.
Jeez. You had a pretty good grasp on the rules of baseball at 10.
Yes, I did. And yeah, so then the next thing that happened was the game was discontinued in 2005, I believe it was.
Okay.
And the next year, like, I just, like, every year that the new set came out, I was always so excited to I would buy a whole booster box at a time of these things to try to, like, get all the players that I wanted. And not being able to do that made me so sad that I went online. I found forums and stuff dedicated to this game, and I found people that had basically taken all of the stats for previous years and kind of scienced that into the formula that Wizards of the Coast uses to create these cards. And I made some tweaks of that on my own for some of the stats. But basically, I went out and bought the Baseball Reference Almanac. And this thing is like probably 8 inches thick. It's basically like a phone book. It has like every single player that's played the game of baseball, their entire career stat lines from like 2005 at the time it was printed to like 1850s probably. It's a lot of stuff. So once I had my formulas for how to make a card, what I would do is every night before I went to bed, I would look up I would just open to a random page and I would make that player's card.
That's awesome.
Open to a random page, make that player's card. I do that for at least 3 players. And so I guess that in and of itself wasn't terribly innovative, but it's always
But you were making your own game. Like, it wasn't
right.
you saw that this game wasn't made anymore, so you decided that you were gonna take matters into your own hands.
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, you're fine.
So you went about making this game. Did you end up getting like a handmade functional deck that you could continue playing this game with?
Um, so I just wrote them down on like index cards, basically. So yeah, I guess I would play with the index cards instead of the regular cards when I had enough of my handmade ones to make a team.
Gotcha. And so,
but I never went so far as to like try to print them out or like get pictures of the players and put them on them, stuff like that.
Yeah, because I mean, when you're a kid, that's like the professional level, like polishing, and I don't think a lot of kids don't make it to what you were doing, and I imagine very few or none at all make it to the level of like professionally printing out like pictures of players and stuff like that. That's really cool. So this MLB The Show?
MLB Showdown.
Here,
let me see if I can find a link for you.
Yeah, that'd be great. So you went from that, and then what? Because I know right now that you develop games, tabletop games in particular, as kind of a hobby in your spare time, and like that's not a very common hobby. Like a lot of people these days, it seems, are more interested in developing like a video game or something along those lines, but and you hear stories about struggling indie developers, but that almost always refers to people in the digital sense and not so much in the tabletop sense. So,
sure.
So how do you get to that point, I guess?
Well, okay, so I guess tabletop games were kind of what I did growing up, because we didn't have video games in my house until Dreamcast was my first gaming system. And so I guess it was always kind of board games and stuff first, and that was the thing that we did with like the family and stuff.
Yeah.
And I guess kind of as I got older, I kind of started shifting more and more towards the video games stuff, and especially like when World of Warcraft came out, and like that was basically my life from 2004 until 2009. And like when I went to school, or when I went to college, I didn't really have a solid idea of what I wanted to do. Kind of up until that point, it had always been, I'm going to be a baseball player. And when reality kind of set in that probably wasn't actually going to be a thing that was going to happen, I kind of had to take that step back and like, oh, what am I actually going to do with my life? And I didn't really have any idea. And I kind of feel like I still don't.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was just kind of, well, we had to do this for a math class in high school, where we had to pick out like an engineering field that sounded interesting and like do a presentation on it. And the field I did was aerospace engineering, and yes, the list that we were given was alphabetical. So then I did that for my first year in college, and I didn't really like it, so I was looking for something else to do instead. And I had computer science classes in high school, and I didn't do as well in those as I did in my other classes, but I still enjoyed like being able to be on the computer and stuff. I liked typing at the minimum.
At the most basic level.
Yeah. And so I figured, well, okay, I like video games. Maybe I could make video games, and you would need a computer science degree to do that. So I decided I'd give that a shot. And I liked it better than aerospace, and but I didn't like it like so much that like, I don't know, I always kind of felt a little bit estranged from the rest of the classmates in Seaside, because they always seemed to be like really into like kind of the theory of computer science programming, and I'm just kind of like, well, this is kind of just a thing I chose. It's more of a means to an end than an actual passion.
Yeah.
And like I was considering switching again until I took AI 1, and that was kind of like AI was the thing that kind of kept me in computer science because it was just such a cool application of it. But I was thinking that was going to be the path, like AI was going to be the path for me to get to making games. I was thinking, I'm going to apply for I did. I applied for internships at Blizzard, Riot Games, just a ton of places, and I never got any of those internships. And that's when I kind of began to realize again that I picked something that is incredibly hard to get into. And so that kind of got put on the back burner, I guess, when I got done with school and I needed to figure out an actual thing to do with my life, like in the immediate sense.
Yeah.
And
to live.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's when I got the job I have now. And while I was there, some of the people that I was working with, we became good friends, and they like board games and stuff too. And I should mention that I played a lot of board games during college as well. That was something that kind of came back to the forefront more towards the later half of my time at college. So it was more fresh in my mind than at least like being a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old working on it, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't know, we were just I think I brought Pandemic, the board game, to work, and we played it at work. And this was an idea I got from a friend, Joel Clemmy. He has like a group at work where they play board games every single day at lunch, and I was really jealous of that. So I wanted to try to get my coworkers to buy into that to at least some degree. So we played Pandemic, and then that got us talking a bit just about games in general and how they had been interested in like making video games before as well. And eventually we got into the topic. I don't know exactly how we got to this, but we started talking about like Mario Kart as a board game. And I was just like, I don't know, the light bulb came on, like, this is totally doable and we should make this. So that's kind of how it started. And we just sat down during a lunch with a deck of cards and just trying to like figure out like what that would look like. And like every single time we came, like, I don't know, I really like thinking about those types of problems, I guess. Like thinking about how something could be modeled as a game mechanic is really enjoyable to me.
Yeah.
And so like it's like taking Mario Kart and like dissecting it into its smallest pieces and figuring out what that looks like on a tabletop. And that's basically how it started. We were like, well, how would items work as a game mechanic? And we were like, well, you could have, decks of cards, you could have like maybe specific items, but then you start thinking about all the things like, well, Mario Kart, if you're in last place, you're going to get a better item than someone who's in first place. So like just, kind of solving all those little problems. And eventually we had something that was playable. And that was when we actually like printed out, we found a picture on JPEG online of a Mario Kart track, like an aerial view.
Yeah.
We just printed that out on a piece of paper at work, and went to the source and bought a handful of their wooden game piece, game piece replacements. They weren't meeples. It was just like the random bag of a random assorted shapes.
Okay, yeah, I know what you're talking about now.
So yeah, we just had a handful of those, and we're like, okay, well, this one's a banana, this one's a shell, this one's Donkey Kong. Just kind of have to remember which is which. And yeah, so we did that, we made that, and it was a ton of fun, and it was really fun to play. And eventually someone asked me, like, what are you going to do with this now? And I was like, well, I don't know. We were just kind of making it for fun, but I guess it'd be really cool if we could do this and make money off of it.
Yeah.
So that's when it kind of became more of a less academic, I guess.
Right.
And more of a well, what would it actually take to do this for real? And that's when I started getting a bit more serious about it, and taking classes online, reading books, going to conventions, all that stuff.
Did you ever try and pitch Nintendo the Mario Kart game?
No, we did not, because we never actually figured out how we should go about that, from a legal standpoint.
Right. Interesting. So it seems like you got into tabletop game dev because you enjoy kind of the problem solving aspect of how do you make this game system fun, enjoyable, and representative of kind of the theme or the core conceit of the game, I guess.
Yeah, and that's the programming. I don't love programming, and knowing what I know, as time has gone on, that's become more and more true. And I just making a video game is such a larger task, and there are still some games that I want to try to make that would be digital, but ultimately I think the thing that I've kind of realized is board games can achieve something from a social aspect that I don't think video games will ever really be able to replicate.
Okay.
At least not until there's more. Maybe there's a VR game in the future that can get there, but it's not the same experience and as a board game. And so there's certainly things that board games can't do that video games can, but I found myself appreciating the social aspect of board gaming more and more as I kind of became more, as the differences of the two became more and more clear to me.
So, what are some things you think that, socially, that board games are better at than video games?
I don't know. So, board games allow a lot more creativity. It's much more based on the people who are playing it than the rule set. You can have the best crafted rule set and people will still kind of tweak it to their own means, as I did. And and that's good and that's fun, and you can make it what you want to make it. And video games, just by the way that code has to exist for a computer to run a program, it's very, very difficult to get that same sort of dynamic environment.
Okay, yeah, just being able to house rule something, you can't do that as easily in a video game as you can in a tabletop game.
Right.
Okay, I get what you mean. And also there's that element of being able to just play with people who are physically present.
Yes. Yeah.
And like the old poker saying, you're playing the player, not necessarily the game. And so that adds just a lot more complexity onto board games, maybe, because you have that you kind of have that tiered system that you're playing on, because you're playing against the person in front of you, and what you know of them and how sneaky they are or not sneaky they are, and then all of the rules of the game. So I get what you're saying. Yeah, there's a lot more nuance there, I think.
Yeah.
And so you made the Mario Kart game. What are some of the lessons that you took away from building your own games as a hobbyist?
The biggest takeaway is that the first 80% is easy and the last 20% is nigh on impossible.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Maybe that's an exaggeration, but that getting a game 80% done is easy. But getting that last 20% of a game completed, polished, and like completely functional is very hard and takes a lot of time.
And by that, do you mean the production end of things, like getting it a nice looking box and getting it nice looking pieces and all of that? Is that the hard part, or are you talking about still just the rules and the mechanics and the basic systems and stuff?
The rules and mechanics and systems, yeah,
Okay.
Not so much. If you want to get something that other people will like, you need to play test it a lot, and you need to be able to play test it with a lot of different people, and everyone's gonna have different opinions on it, and I'm sure it's true of video game development as well. But yeah, that's something that we as a group have definitely struggled with. We've never been short for ideas, but we have always had trouble taking something past iteration, X.
What becomes the major stumbling block?
The major stumbling block. Part of it is just, I guess, kind of the group of people that we have. Our personalities, we're idea people. We're not get it done people, I guess.
So it's hard to let it be.
Yes, it's hard to identify when something isn't working, or how do I describe this? So when something isn't working and it's not working, mechanic, a system, whatever. The idea of, is it trying to identify if it is an inherently flawed idea or if it just needs tweaks? Because if it's an inherently flawed idea, you should just scrap it and move on to the next idea.
Okay.
Or you just end up trying to iterate on this thing forever. And so we did the latter the first time through, where we're just iterating on Mario Kart for forever and never really actually kind of solved the problems that we were having with games taking too long, or trying to mostly kind of all revolving around game length. But for a lot of the other games, it was kind of, I feel like we've been too quick to throw out an idea instead of iterating on it.
Okay.
But it's a hard balance to find.
Yeah, and I imagine it's also hard to play test a lot of those ideas outside of your group of developers that you work with, because it just seems like it's maybe easier to find people to QA a game like that. That's like a built-in, and by game
Right.
I mean like a digital
game. Yeah. Yeah, you can just release the code, as a demo or whatever, and boom, you have thousands of people that can play test it.
Right.
Whereas me, it's I'm begging people, please play a board game with me for an hour.
So what can you give another example of a game that you put together It doesn't have to have been like finished, obviously, but just a few of the ideas you have knocking around.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the other one that we got to the next like closest point of completion. Well, actually, it was a completed game. Um, our working title was Death Train, and basically it was a train race. So we kind of had this idea where it'd be really cool to have this mechanic where you have a train and you're racing against other trains on a track on parallel tracks, and the mechanic is like you physically are moving your train along this track back and forth by adjusting your speed, and kind of how you line up with the players on the other tracks is how you interact with them. So like we had this thing where you're building cars as you're going. We're calling it a train builder as opposed to like a deck builder, and you're building your train as you go. You're adding cars onto it, and the cars would be anything from like an extra engine to a Tesla coil that zaps your adjacent train enemies, and that one was actually really fun, and it was pretty much working. The problems we ran into with that one were that we were trying to do a little bit too much, I think, because we didn't want it to just be a race. We didn't want it to just be a battle. We wanted there to be multiple paths to victory, kind of Euro game it. And so we added in victory points and all this other stuff that kind of muddied the waters a bit too much.
Do you just then kind of leave that idea behind and then move on to something new, or like, I guess what happens when you hit that 80% done?
Right. So it kind of it goes on a shelf basically. I don't know. So a lot of the things I've read in my kind of pursuit of more knowledge about game design, some people, I guess there's different schools of thought on it, but there's a number of people that like to have multiple games that you're working on at the same time and kind of advocate for that. And so like, sorry, I'm not being very coherent with these thoughts. So, okay. Like if you're a writer, Jack, do you ever just sit down and like say, I'm going to write now and I need to have this much done and it's going to be great? Or,
yes.
Or do you just write things when the inspiration strikes you?
Depending on the project, it's one or the other, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So, are you saying it's similar? Like you...
Yeah.
Okay.
So the idea behind having a bunch of games that you're working on at the same time is, you're working on game C and you come across something that might be applicable to games A, F, and G, then maybe you can revisit those games with that new idea, and it just kind of all cycles along with it.
Okay.
And so I like that, but it's a slow churn through that last 20% with that method.
Yeah. And the alternative is just trying to brute force your way through the last 20%, which is also grueling, just in a different way.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I see where you're going with that. One thing you mentioned, like reading and resources and learning about game design. What have you found most helpful when setting out to make a board game from scratch?
In terms of resources?
Yeah, in terms of like books or lectures or forums or whatever.
Sure. 1 second, let me find this. The most useful for me was a Coursera track path or specialization, whatever they call it. Okay, so there is a specialization track on Coursera on game design from the California Institute of the Arts.
Okay.
And I took that. It's 4 courses, 4 weeks each, and that got me a lot more insight than I had going in. So I didn't start doing this until after we had finished Mario Kart and we're part way through, kind of when we started hitting the first roadblocks with Death Train. And that's the point where we got to like, okay, maybe we need to take a step back here and kind of actually figure out what it is we're doing here.
Yeah.
As opposed to just kind of, Wild Westing it or whatever. And so Coursera was one of the first places I went for that, and I really enjoyed that course. It was that specialization. It was a lot of fun, and I've learned a lot from that. I think the next most is probably a book. Let me get the title real quick. The Kobold Guide to Board Game Design.
Okay.
by Mike. Oh, my phone is not cooperating, but it's
by Mike.
Mike S.
And that was just really helpful, giving you a broad idea of designing games?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the book specifically is more of just a book of interviews of a bunch of different game designers and kind of taking their opinions on a bunch of different things. And so it's kind of, it's cool to see how like Steve Jackson thinks about, or like what Steve Jackson is thinking when he's starting to make a game. And that kind of really helps give you some insight as to like what things maybe you're doing well or what things you're not really taking into account that you could be.
Okay.
Stuff like that. Oh, and also there's a podcast that I also started listening to around the same time that I did the Coursera courses. And that's Designer Notes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm familiar with that one.
Yeah, so Designer Notes actually was probably the most influential, actually, yeah.
Okay. It might also be one of the most accessible of the ones you mentioned.
Yes.
So, having done all of this, and having kind of gotten your experience in designing these games, I guess what would you recommend people do if they want to get into designing a tabletop game? Like, what do you do? What are your first steps?
Your first steps are to just get something made and on a table in front of people to play it. The most progress that we as a group have ever made is just by actually doing. And like you learn so much more about what works and what doesn't when you're actually sitting at a table trying to play it. Like you can have the best ideas in the world and then you take it to the table and they don't work, and then you're back to square one. And like I can't stress enough like how important it is to have something that is like getting something to a playable form as quickly as possible, even if it's absolutely horrible. As long as you can play it, you're learning something from it, because you're not actually learning what you think you might be learning until you're actually playing it.
Okay. And what does it mean to get something on the table when it is like first draft of a tabletop game?
Sure.
Because I think maybe some people struggle with that. Like, how do you make a thing?
Well, I mean, it depends on the game. I mean, it depends on so many different things. But in its simplest form, you just want to see taking an idea and trying to figure out, does the simplest form of that idea kind of translate to a board game or a card game or what have you. So it's taking, it could just be random scraps of paper and some dice and sitting down and figuring out, what's an interesting way to make these things move around on a track. Mm-hmm. And you're just sitting there and literally rolling dice and kind of seeing like what is fun. I mean, that's what game design is. It's engineering fun.
Yeah. What would you tell someone to do? They get it to 80% and they feel like maybe they're getting it even close to 100%. How do you make this game into an actual, like, sold for money board game?
Well, so I mean, that's a part that I haven't got to.
Right.
But so you might take my advice with some grains of salt. But
you might have more insight than your average bear.
Sure. I mean, I've definitely looked into that. So I mean, there's Kickstarter, but that has a whole bag of intricacies by itself. You could write to publishers. So these are kind of more advanced steps. Like, I guess it depends on how you got to that feeling of 100% done. Mm-hmm. Like if you've had a whole bunch of people play test it, and when I say a whole bunch, I mean like hundreds of people play test it, and you've and not just friends, but like just random strangers, people who some you gave the rules to and some that you didn't, and like if you haven't done a lot of playtesting, I don't think you're at 100%.
Okay.
So I would say the first thing is playtest as much as you possibly can. But if you truly are at that point where you feel like it's as good as it's going to be, and no more playtesting is going to help that, then I think your next steps are probably one of three things, at least that I personally have been kind of like looking into as my next steps. There's probably others, but these are just kind of the things that I've been looking at doing myself. So the first is conventions. Here in Minneapolis, there's Con of the North. That's in February, I believe.
Yeah.
Every February in Plymouth. So like there's pretty much any tabletop convention, there's going to be like a space for forget exactly what they call it, but like for like playtest halls sort of deal. Okay. Where these are games that are known to be like in a prototype phase, and you're signing up to playing it knowing that it's not necessarily a completed game. And so this is a great way to get more playtesters and get feedback from strangers like that. But it's also a good place to kind of make contacts and maybe run into a publisher that you might be able to pitch the idea to or get feedback from, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And then speaking about publishers, pitching your idea to a publisher is an option. And obviously that can be hard. I mean, well, Jack, you've published works. You know it's hard to find a publisher.
Very true.
It's not dissimilar from books, I'm assuming, in that regard. You have to do your research. You have to know what kinds of games the publisher has published in the past, what kinds of games they're publishing now. It has to kind of fit in with their MO as a publisher, and also with kind of what they have in their pipeline already. And then the last one would be Kickstarter. And Kickstarter is the one that's going to make you the most money if it's successful. Probably. I guess there's... Yeah, I can't...
All the caveats.
I can't say that with certainty, but, at least you are controlling that entirely yourself. It's not it's not you selling your idea to a publisher. But Kickstarter there's a lot of hoops to jump through with Kickstarter to get that to work, and it's risky. So one of the things that we've kind of learned at conventions is like to produce a board game at scale is very expensive.
I bet.
Like if you're talking like a medium-sized board game, with some components, maybe not a ton of components, some components, but with a board, I mean, you're looking at $60,000 to get that thing published, or not produced. Sorry.
Yeah.
And if you're going to Kickstarter, you're going to have to ask for less than that, significantly less than that, as your goal. People have done all kinds of research as to what your goal value should be to like get people to contribute to your Kickstarter and stuff like that. And yeah, so if you end up going that route and it's unsuccessful and like you've already footed the bill for your $60,000 worth of production, then you're going to be in trouble. But so yeah, you have to know what you're doing with the Kickstarter.
Right. I'm trying to think if there are any other questions I want to ask. Do you have anything you want to add?
Oh, I feel like that kind of ended on a little bit of a down note. I don't want to sound like doom and gloom. This is so hard and it's expensive and risky, but I mean, ultimately, I think it's worth it no matter what, because one of the favorite things that I've read in my perusal of these resources is if you make a game, that game is going to be at least one person's favorite game. There is absolutely at least one person in the world that game would be their favorite game. So like, just think about that and think about how happy you're making at least that one person. Yeah. Because, I mean, yeah, there's nothing quite like enjoying your favorite game, and it's even better when you can see other people enjoying something to that degree that you've made.
Yeah. No, you're kind of almost like you're giving back to all of the games that you enjoyed, putting your own little bit of that in the world.
Yeah. The world can be a pretty crappy place sometimes, so if you can make it even a little bit happier sometimes, then I feel like that's worth it.